Okay, hi everyone. So I'm going to do another science and technology Q&A intended for kids and some others, but mostly for kids. Our particular topic today is about how things work. So don't guarantee to be able to answer all of these, but ask me whatever you want and I'll do my best. And logistically, we will be going for just a little bit over an hour here and not longer than that. Great. So who wants to start off here? Let's see, we seem to have a something coming here. How do antibodies work? Okay, let's see if I can say something about that. So this is about the human immune system, and it's the basic problem of that the immune system is trying to solve is when some foreign intruder comes into one's body, how do we notice it and how do we get rid of it? And the basic idea is every cell in our body has a DNA sequence, and every cell that's in us has the same DNA sequence. So I think we have maybe 100 trillion cells in our bodies. Every one of those cells, the way that it knows how to produce proteins that make muscle or hair or skin or heart cells or whatever, is through this program that's specified in this DNA molecule. And so every time a new cell is produced, it comes with a copy of the DNA molecule from whatever cells it came from. And actually, a human DNA molecule, if you stretch it all the way out, it would be a single molecule that's about a meter long. That DNA molecule, that's what says how you should build the things that we want in the cells in our body. Okay, so any intruder, any living intruder, like a bacterium or a virus, it has its own DNA. Actually, some viruses, like the coronavirus, have RNA, which is kind of like half of a DNA, but it's the same idea. They have their own RNA or DNA, and they have their own instructions, their own program for what for how to make the things that will make a new virus or make pieces of bacterium or something like this. And so sort of the fundamental problem of the immune system is if you see a cell in your body and that cell has a certain RNA or DNA in it, tell whether that's your own DNA or whether that's a foreign intruder's DNA. Now, it's a little bit more complicated immediately because, for example, a virus, what it does is it tries to take over the apparatus inside a cell that makes things, proteins and things inside the cell, and that's all happening inside the cell. And there's an issue of the fact that the immune system can only get to see things on the surface of a cell, and so that's sort of one of the challenges for the immune system is it only gets to see what's on the surface of a cell, whereas when a virus infects a cell, it's going into the center of the cell and starting to try to take over what's happening inside the cell. Okay, so and as I say, the program that is in our DNA, it's about 6 billion base pairs long. So if you go look at a piece of at a sequence from DNA, it'll read, A, T, G, C. There are these 4 letters, A, T, C, and G, and it's some long combination of those letters. And that long combination of letters is the program that makes us. For example, this coronavirus that we're all fighting right now, its program it's an RNA program, and it's just 29,000 base pairs long. So the question that we have is, given given our genome and given the genome of well, actually, you know what? I'm going to actually show you something. I'm going to show you something. If I can pull this in, let's see whether I can do this just for a second. Not sure if this is going to work, but I'm going to give it a try. I thought, let me actually pull in. Maybe this is too difficult. Maybe I'm sorry. I'm not going to try and do this. I was going to actually pull in on my computer the genome for the coronavirus, and the human genome, and I was going to look at where there start to be overlaps. So, for example, if we say, if our immune system said, if ever we see AAAAA in our in the genome of a particular cell, then it must be bad. It wouldn't say that because probably AAAA, let me find out, I just go look this up. Wolfram alpha has a convenient way of just, I'm going to make, let's say AGT, 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 CC. Okay, so that's a particular sequence on the genome, and what Wolfram alpha is telling us is it says there might be as many as 1,500 matches on the human genome to that particular sequence here. Let me actually, I'm going to share this just for the hell of it. Hold on. Okay, here we go. So let me make this a lot bigger. All right, so I just asked it. This is a possible little piece of program from a genome. So there, let me ask it about that sequence. Okay, so what this says is on the human genome, that particular sequence of A's and G's and C's and so on never appears in the human genome. So if we ever saw that inside us, we would know it was an intruder. Okay, let me just change this a bit. Let me make it a bit shorter. And chances are, if we have a shorter sequence, okay, so there we go. So that particular sequence, if we saw that sequence there, well, actually that sequence occurs in the human genome. It's, let's look at what it is. It seems to occur twice in the human genome, once on the X chromosome, once on chromosome 2. Just to give you a sense of how this works, this gene is a little subprogram on the genome, and let's find out what FTCDNL1, what that gene actually is. Let's see what it says. Oh, didn't know what it was. More interpretations, human gene. Let's see what that, no, it doesn't know what it is. Okay, well, let's try this one here. Okay, this is something very obscure, okay? I don't know what this is. This is a mammalian retrotransposon-derived protein 4 zinc finger domain containing protein 6. So that's a little piece of the machine code of how we work. That's a little program that makes a particular protein that does something. I don't know, I actually do know what this means, but it's not, doesn't really help me. This is like telling me that this is part of the, part of the input-output system that deals with reading, events from the keyboard or something if it was a computer, but this is actually for an organism, for humans. Okay, but so this is something where if we saw, so we go back to that sequence again. So that's what, if we see this sequence here, then this sequence is something that, yes, that can appear, will appear in the human genome. So if you see that on a cell in us humans, leave it alone. It's fine. It's a human cell. It's all good. But on the other hand, if you see some other sequence, it will be a sequence where you can say, no, couldn't possibly occur in the human genome, must be an intruder. And once you notice it must be an intruder, then the goal of the immune system is go attack that intruder, kill off that cell, get rid of it from our bodies. Okay, so let me go ahead here, stop showing that. So that's kind of the objective of the immune system is it a piece of genome that's from us, which means it's okay, or a piece of genome that's from the intruder, which means it isn't okay? All right, so how on earth does it tell that? It's quite clever. So what it's doing is it has, well, the full mechanism is a little complicated, but basically we are remembering in these things called B cells, we're remembering sequences that that we have noticed before are intruder sequences. And so, for example, when you get your IgG level measured, if you get an antibody test for the coronavirus, what it will do is it will measure the level of IgG, immunoglobulin G, in your blood, and a particular immunoglobulin G. It's the one that encodes a sequence that comes from the coronavirus. And so what's happening is your immune system in that case knows if you see that sequence, it is bad, go attack it. In the case where it hasn't seen the virus before, or it hasn't seen one of those intruders before, it takes the immune system a while. The immune system is always generating collections of possible antibodies, and it's trying to figure out, are those, well, okay, I should explain how the antibodies work. Boy, this whole mechanism is a little complicated, actually. What is ultimately going to happen is, again, the key idea is the sequence that you see a sequence that is a human sequence or an intruder sequence? And by the way, when you get autoimmune diseases like asthma or type 1 diabetes, one of these kinds of things, what's happening is that your immune system is deciding to be overactive and is saying that sequence that, there's a sequence that I'm seeing, and actually that sequence is one that I think is an intruder, even though really it's a sequence that is really just an okay human sequence. And the way things work is the question of what's a U sequence and what's another sequence. That's encoded, actually. The way it works, there's a thing called the thymus gland, which is something that is very active when one's younger. Stopped by the time you're as old as me, it's probably doing absolutely nothing. But it's the thing that learns when you're young what cells, what the sequences that correspond to you are, and what and by sort of exclusion, it knows what sequences don't correspond to you. But so what happens is the goal, well, okay, little complicated here, because the antibodies are things that will attach themselves to cells that are found to be intruder cells. And the antibodies have little things that are like genetic sequences on them that say, if there's a cell like this that has a sequence like this, then this antibody will attach to that cell. And once the cell has been tagged with antibodies, then the immune system knows to sort of bring out its big guns and try and kill off that cell. It's a little bit complicated because when you generate antibodies, the immune system has to be careful to not generate too many antibodies. And so it tends to have some system which is not particularly well understood, where you generate antibodies to some antigen, some intruder sequence, and then there are anti-antibodies generated that kind of kick down the level of antibodies. At least that's what people think happens. And of all the possible, so what if you look at the way that antibodies work, they are looking at that, they're asking the question, does a particular chunk of genome sequence occur? So again, what length is it? I don't remember. I think it may be length 9, maybe length 12. I can't remember. But they're little short sequences. And because of the way the math works out, by the time you have a length 12 sequence, for example, you can be pretty certain whether that sequence is a human sequence or not. There are enough different possibilities for that sequence that if it's it either is a human sequence or it isn't a human sequence. It won't be a human sequence by chance, so to speak. And so what then has to happen is these antibodies have their own sort of variability, and they can connect to these. They will notice these little short sequences, and I think there are about 100 billion different kinds of antibodies that can exist. And when you develop antibodies for a particular virus, what's happening is that some of those antibodies are ones whose sequences match the sequences of that virus, and will be the things that will then mark cells that are infected with that virus so that the rest of the immune system can go attack it. That's roughly, I mean, it's a very rough version of how antibodies work. There's sort of a famous picture of antibodies. It's kind of a Y-shaped molecule, and there's a region on the antibody, so-called hypervariable region, that is the part of the antibody that has very variable things in it that is used to kind of match the sequences in the intruders that exist in your cells. And the way cells have a mechanism for sort of taking the stuff that's inside them and grinding it up into little short sequences and exposing them on the surface of the cell so that the immune system can kind of go check cells and find out whether they have anything bad going on inside them. There's a thing called the MHC, the major histocompatibility complex, which is, let's see, you are testing my knowledge of this, but there's a, that's what ends up being, let's see, that's part of the mechanism for exposing fragments of things that are contained within a cell on the surface of the cell, so the immune system can go and check them out, so to speak. All right, that was a, sorry, that was a little bit, it's a slightly complicated mechanism, and I left out a lot of details in explaining that, but maybe that gives some idea of how things work. All right, next question we have here is, what's the relationship between electricity and magnetism? Okay, this is something that was discovered in the 1800s, and I can tell you sort of the main story here. So electricity is in something like a wire is a flow of electrons. So electrons are little particles that are what are inside atoms, but electrons are also what make electricity. Electricity is made of large numbers of electrons. Each electron has a little amount of electric charge, and an electric current is the flow of electrons. So it's like you have all these electrons, and if they're moving down a wire, and that motion of charge from one place to another is electric current. And so what one usually when one talks about electricity, one's usually talking about the flow of electrons, the flow of these electric charges, for example, down a wire. Okay, so that's sort of the basic idea of what electricity is. What is magnetism? Well, magnetism, so you might say, so magnetism is what, for example, you get in a magnet, and in a magnet, what one way to get magnetism is to have electricity. For example, if you have an electric current that's going around in a circle, then it's just a fact about physics that an electric current going around in a circle produces a magnetic field, produces magnetism, where the magnetism is kind of corresponds to something where, okay, so where the magnetism is, if the electric current is going around in that circle there's a magnetic field that goes up this way. How do you notice a magnetic field? If you get, for example, iron filings, just iron ground up into little powder, and you put them around a magnet, then they will arrange themselves in the magnetic field lines, and they'll look like a thing where there's the magnet. If the magnet is here, then the field lines will come out and go around like that. So the magnet, for example, a magnet has a north pole and a south pole. Let's say they're just called that because the Earth has a magnetic field. The Earth is like a giant magnet, and there are these lines of magnetic force that go from North Pole to South Pole, for example. So you might ask the question, one question you might ask is, well, electrons are the sort of smallest components of electricity. What are the smallest components of magnetism? So electrons have an electric charge, and you might say, well, is there a magnetic charge that's like electric charge that sort of makes magnetism? The answer is no, doesn't appear to be the case in our universe. There is a theoretical kind of particle called a magnetic monopole, which would be the magnetic analog of an electron. It will be something that makes magnetic field like an electron makes electric field. It will be something that has a magnetic charge like an electron has an electric charge. So far as we know, magnetic monopoles do not exist. The laws of physics don't allow magnetic monopoles to exist. And when you have a magnet, it always has like a north pole and a south pole. It's like if you had, if you have electricity, you could have something where it always would have a positive charge at one end, a negative charge at the other end. You can never kind of saw it for electricity, you can kind of saw it in the middle and you can separate off. This is the positive charge, this is the negative charge. For magnetism, that isn't possible. You can't sort of saw off the north pole end of a magnet and have it be its own separate magnetic monopole. They always come in pairs. So at least that's what seems to be the case in our universe. So what is magnetism? We can think of both electricity and magnetism as being features of this thing that's called the electromagnetic field. It doesn't really help very much to say that, because that's just saying there's this thing that's a combination of electricity and magnetism. I think it's probably fair to say that it's just, we just know about physics that this field exists, and what is true about it is when there's a moving electric, when there's an electric current, and that is like going around in a circle, for example, it makes a magnetic field. When there's a changing electric field, it makes a magnetic field. It's also true that when there's a changing magnetic field, it makes an electric field. That fact about when there's a change in one of these fields, it makes the other one, that's what allows you to have electromagnetic waves, of which light or radio waves are two examples. So, I mean, now if you ask a question, since we've been developing this fundamental theory of physics, you might ask, how do electricity and magnetism work in that fundamental theory of physics? We actually have a pretty decent idea of how that might happen. It's a little complicated because it requires, let's think, is there a way I can explain this? It's probably too complicated to explain for now. Ask again in a few weeks. We may have a better explanation then. So anyway, but that's the main thing to remember is sort of an electric current, for example, going in a circle, makes a magnetic field. Actually, an electric current, even in a wire, just going in one line, makes a moving electric charge, or an electric current makes a magnetic field. And that's the way magnetic fields get made. Electric current is just the motion of electric charges. There aren't magnetic charges so far as we know. So magnetism works a little bit differently. All right, there's a question here. Why is the sky blue? Okay. Well, let's see if we can figure out a little bit about that from just simple sort of thinking. So here are two facts we know. The sky looks blue, and the sun at sunset or sunrise looks red. So normally the sun looks white. White light is made of a combination of sort of all the colors of the rainbow, going all the way from red through yellow, green, blue, and then eventually to blue. Okay, so red is at one end, blue is at the other end of the rainbow and of the spectrum. When we say those different colors are at different ends, what's happening is light is made from, we can think of it as being made from a stream of photons, and each of those photons, either a stream of photons or an electromagnetic wave of the kind I was talking about. And what happens is blue light, each electron has a slightly higher energy than in red light. So each electron, they go at the same speed, they go at the speed of light, but the electrons can have different energies, and that means when the photons can have different energies, and that means, for example, when they interact with a camera or something like that, they can. Well, actually, I'm cheating a little bit because that's not actually how it works. But I was going to say that the photon can cause a little bit. This is roughly true. The photon, the higher the energy of the photon, the larger amount of electricity it will produce when there's a detector like the retina in your eye, or the detector in a webcam or something. Roughly the higher the energy of the photon, the larger the electricity it will produce. So every photon of light has a certain energy. The blue light has a slightly higher energy than the red light. Okay, so next let's look at what happens from the sun. The sun is roughly white. It has a mixture of all these different colors. it has it has photons of red light, it has photons of blue light. They're all coming to us from the sun. Okay, so now let's ask the question, in order for the photons to get to us, to get to our eyes from the sun, they have to go through the Earth's atmosphere. They have to go through the 50 miles or so of air that exists as the atmosphere around the Earth. Okay, so what happens when the photons go through the air? Well, what happens is every so often one of those photons will hit a molecule of air, a nitrogen molecule, an oxygen molecule, will hit one of those molecules, and it will be scattered in some other direction. So what happens is the photon comes in, and the photon just hits one of those molecules, and it will be made just like a billiard ball or something bouncing off something. It will bounce and go in a different direction. Okay, so let's say we're looking at the sun, and we're seeing it in the sky. When we see it, there'll be a certain distance of air that is between us and the sun. So all the photons that are coming from the sun go through that distance of air. And so there'll be red photons, blue photons, etc. They all come to us. Okay. At sunrise, for example, the sun is going through a larger length of air than it is when the sun is high in the sky, because we're looking at it through, we're kind of looking at it like the atmosphere is going around the Earth, and we're looking further through the atmosphere when it's at sunrise than if we're just looking straight up and going sort of straight out of the atmosphere. We're looking kind of along the surface of the Earth, which means we're looking through more atmosphere there. Okay, so what's happening then? The light from the sun has to come to us through a larger amount of air. And when so that means that light, the photons that are in that light, have more chance to hit molecules in the air because there's more air that they're going to go through. And so that means that there's more chance for those molecules to be scattered, that is, to hit a molecule of air and to be pushed off in another direction. Okay, so next fact is that blue light, higher energy photons, have a somewhat larger chance of being scattered by air molecules. And that is not, well, that's a phenomenon. It's called Rayleigh scattering. And I could probably explain to you why that happens. But let's just take that as a fact, that if you're a blue photon, if you're a photon of blue light, which means slightly higher energy photon, then there's a higher chance that you are scattered in a different direction by hitting a molecule in the air. Okay, so then light from the sun is coming to us, at sunrise. All this white light, mixture of red and blue photons and so on, is coming to us, but more blue photons are being scattered away. And so that means the ones that actually make it to our eyes are more likely to be red photons. And that's why the sun looks redder at sunrise and sunset. It's going through more air. There's more chance for the blue photons to be scattered away, so we don't see them. And so instead, we're just seeing the red photons. Okay, so given this explanation, you can perhaps guess why the sky might be blue, because there's light coming from the sun, and even when the sun is high in the sky, there's still every photon that has to come from the sun has to come to us, has to go through the air. And what's happening is the blue photons are being more likely to be scattered off in different directions, and to essentially be ones where they'll be scattered as they come in from the sun, then they'll be, let's say, scattered again from another molecule in there, and then they'll get to our eyes. And the blueness of the sky comes from the fact that there are photons that are coming from the sun, and they're scattered out of the way into a different part of the sky, and then they come to our eyes. And the ones where that happens more are the blue photons. So that's why the sky looks blue, is because that's photons coming from the sun. The red photons have less chance to be scattered, so they're more likely to just go straight ahead and not get scattered. And so we just see them as part of the whiteness of the sun, unless they're going through a big column of air as they do at sunrise or sunset. And then it will be the red ones that are more likely to survive. So the sun will look red, but the things that aren't the sun, that are just that are light, that can't come directly from the sun, but gets scattered out of the way by molecules in the air, then comes to us and then comes to our eyes. That's why the sky looks blue. Now, if you go up if you go high enough up, the sky will stop looking blue, because there isn't enough there isn't enough air that the photons have to come through, that there's significant scattering. So if you, for example, I remember once I went on the Concorde supersonic plane, which flew at, what was it, 50,000 feet maybe? So a typical plane flies at 35,000 feet or so. Maybe a small plane might fly a little bit higher than that. But from the Concorde, one of the cool things was that it was daytime flight, but the sky was black. And the sky was black because there wasn't enough air above one so that the photons from the sun could be scattered off in different directions, and the blue ones more than the others, and then scatter back to us and make the sky seem to be blue. So that's the story. Why really scattering preferentially scatters blue light? Maybe we can talk about that another time. That's the answer to that. Let's see. There's a question here from Ethan. All right, how could Mathematica lower the time needed to make new vaccines? Let me explain what, what is a vaccine doing? A vaccine, I explained a little bit about how the immune system works. What a vaccine is trying to do is it's trying to pretend that you are being exposed to a particular virus or whatever, bacteria, whatever, to a particular foreign genome sequence. And it's trying to pretend that. And what it wants to do is it wants to make your immune system really wake up and say, gosh, this is an intruder. I've got to build antibodies to that thing. And I've got to set up cells that will remember how to build antibodies to that thing. But I've got to do that without getting sick, so to speak. So in other words, it's got to be the case that the vaccine presents this intruder's genome sequence and says, this is a bad genome sequence. Immune system, pay attention to this. Rather than, and that could happen if one got sick with the disease, there will be billions of copies of that genome sequence circulating all over your body, and the immune system will wake up and say, gosh, this must be an intruder, I've got to pay attention to it. But what vaccines try to do is they try to trick the immune system into thinking that this is a really important sequence and it must be an intruder, go create antibodies to it, without having to have a very large number of copies of that intruder sequence. And so they do that by having additional molecules that activate a more primitive part of the immune system. Typically they do it this way, at least, that's sort of below the level of all of the stuff about recognizing genome sequences. But that part of the immune system is kind of an early warning system that tells the main sort of sophisticated immune system, go pay attention to what's happening at this particular place, at this particular site where a vaccine was injected into your muscle or whatever. That's a place where there's something really important going on. Immune system, go and check that out and go and make antibodies to it. Okay, so one of the many issues is, well, first question is, what part of the genome of the bacterium or the virus, for example, do you put into the vaccine? That's one issue. Do you put, to what extent is that little piece of the virus something that is likely to be, well, for example, in the influenza virus, it changes. There's a lot of mutation and evolution in the influenza virus. And there isn't a universal flu vaccine because nobody's found sort of a sequence in the flu virus that is sort of specific enough to flu viruses that it couldn't get confused with something that's in humans or some other thing that is important to you, but will be always the same in every flu virus. But the more important thing is that this sort of thing that says to the immune system, go pay attention to this particular place, that is a tricky thing. And to get that to work is tricky. To get it to work without side effects, to get it to work so the immune system pays enough attention, it's all tricky. What people are hoping is that there will be these sort of universal platforms for making vaccines. And that's what, of the vaccines that people are trying to the COVID-19, well, to the coronavirus, those vaccines are mostly being based on existing sort of universal platforms, existing things where there's sort of a standard method for where you just say insert sequence here, and then and then they'll sort of activate the immune system in a certain way. But it's a tricky thing, and I think um, so another issue is, once you think you have a good vaccine, how do you test it? You want to make sure it doesn't give people some nasty side effect. You want to make sure it's effective. And I think probably one of the areas where there's, in terms of sort of mathematical work and the things that, for example, our software tools are used for, that they used a bunch for the sort of the molecular biology of these things, but they're also used for studying the sort of mathematical questions about how do you really best do a trial of a vaccine? How many people do you test it on? How long do you have to wait? How sure are you that there aren't going to be side effects? Do you test it on a range of people of different ages, different, genders, different this, different that, different medical conditions, and so on? How do you do all that testing? How do you kind of slice it up so that, let's say you're eventually going to give this vaccine to 1 billion people? You have to be quite sure that it won't be the case. If something went wrong 1 in 1,000,000 times, so 1 in 1,000,000 people, then 1,000 people, it'll go wrong for them. But you have to try and guess whether something's going to go wrong without having to give it to those billion people first. So you have to do that by trying to figure out what's the best sort of experiments you can do. Try one person with these characteristics, one person with these characteristics. Does it go wrong for that? Does it go wrong for that? Can you break these things apart? That's a typical kind of problem that has to be solved there. So, gosh, lots of questions here. There's a question here from Kevin saying he's currently a senior, don't have much to do. Just started with mathematics to learn how to program. Do you have any fun projects or ideas that I could do during this time? A good place to get some suggestions for that is if you go look at our summer camp, summer camp for high school students. I don't know whether senior, I'm assuming high school senior. You'll find the projects that have been done in previous years. Go look at those projects and see if you can find perhaps a variant on one of those projects that seems interesting to you. Then another suggestion would be, go look at our demonstrations project. It has about 12,000 interactive demonstrations. Go find ones that you think look interesting and make your own better versions of things like that, and then send them into the demonstrations project. Those are a couple of suggestions. Okay, there's a question. Let's see, which one? There's a lot of interesting questions here. All right, there's one just came in from Vance. How does Facebook know that I wanted a new VR headset when I didn't tell anyone? Okay, that's an interesting question. So this whole question of showing ads to people, what people want to do is to show ads to people who are going to care about what they're being shown as an ad. So for example, if somebody shows me an ad for, I don't know, cigars, it's a wasted ad because I've never had a cigar in my life and I don't ever expect to have one. So that ad is going to not be a useful ad to show me. If they show me an ad for a VR headset, well, I actually have a few of those already, but maybe I might be interested in that. If they show me an ad for a book about something about the history of quantum mechanics or something, I might right now be really interested in that. That might be a real good hit. The question is, how do you guess what kind of ad I'll be interested in? So basically, you have to know a certain amount about me. So what always used to happen when ads mostly appeared in, well, ads in like newspapers, ads in television shows, the idea there is, okay, let's say there's a television show and it is it's a baking show, for example, okay. Then what you have to do is figure out, if people are watching the baking show, what kinds of things are they likely to be interested in? So for instance, they're watching a baking show, there's a decent chance they might be interested in, kitchen utensils. or they might be interested in, I'm showing my complete ignorance of these things, but they might be interested in, people advertising things that you can use to put in the stuff that you bake, cookie mix or something. There's a good chance that you'd be interested in something like that. If you're watching a baking show and there's no particular reason to believe that you will be interested in vacations to the Antarctic, for example, right? So it'd be kind of a waste to put an ad for a vacation to the Antarctic in the middle of a baking show. Similarly, if you have a show about travel to the Antarctic, putting a thing about cookie dough in that show is probably kind of a waste, right? So the thing is, if you have television shows, for example, you try to get an idea of the demographic, the kinds of people who watch that show, and then you try to figure out what kinds of ads are likely to be relevant to those people. So, for example, for a television show or something like that, the way that's done is there is a sampling. So some people choose to say, I'm going to, there's a company called Nielsen, for example, that gives people these little boxes that kind of measure every show that they watch. And they know something about those people, and they know what shows they're watching. And so they compile kind of information that says, this show that maybe, nobody necessarily knows, when a show is made, they don't necessarily know who's going to watch it. And suddenly that show may become popular among, I don't know, 13-year-old girls who like video games. Who knows? And that may be a demographic that develops for that show, which the people who created the show had no idea would be relevant. But so what's done for like a television show is you're just sampling people who watch the show, and you're trying to compile information on who watches that show. Okay, so that's sort of the traditional model of advertising. What's happened in social media is something a little bit more complicated, which is that the information that exists about you comes from what you look at. It comes from a variety of things, but it comes from what you look at in social media. It comes from things like who your friends are, what kinds of things you post in social media, all these kinds of things. So if you're posting a bunch of stuff about where let's say you asked about a VR headset, if you post a bunch of things talking about virtual reality, then if the system is watching what you're posting, then it can say, oh, this is a person interested in virtual reality. Okay, I've got this advertiser over here who says they're looking for people who are interested in virtual reality. Let's match them up and have that ad shown to this person who posted about virtual reality. Now, of course, it's a very tricky issue, because the question of how how you tell what somebody is really interested in, how the advertiser describes the set of people that they want to reach, it's all quite complicated. And you'll find different companies, Facebook, Twitter, etc., they use different methods for allowing advertisers to pick who they want to advertise to. They also, in some cases, there's a lot of complicated things that happen. I mean, there's a lot of things that personally I'm not a big huge. I mean, it's complicated to know what it's a sort of artificial intelligence system that's trying to figure out. Well, there is another issue, which is different advertisers will pay different amounts of money for having their ad reach different kinds of people. So, for example, the VR advertiser might say, I will bid 25 cents to show this ad to a person with these characteristics. Okay, and another thing might be some, I don't know, television show, or might be some, I don't know what, I have no idea, some other thing, some video game or something, will say, I'll bid 30 cents to show this ad to somebody with these other set of characteristics. And so there's this complicated market that happens actually in real time nowadays. But before the ads actually show up on your screen, there will have been this bidding that will have happened where multiple advertisers will have said, that person, I want to get them looking at my ad. That person, they don't know who you are specifically, they don't know your name, but they know certain features about you. and they're trying to match up the features that they know about you based on the posts you made, the friends you have, all those kinds of things, with what they think their ad is going to be successful for. And of course, then they can measure if they bid on a bunch of people who have these characteristics, they can measure, was their ad successful with those people or not? How do they tell whether the ad was successful? They tell because they can look at whether you clicked on that ad. So they know directly. It's much easier than, for example, a television ad where they don't really know directly whether you responded to the ad. I mean, sometimes I have to admit I don't watch television really. So these used to be the case, and I may be way out of date, that in late night television, there would often be these direct response ads where there'll be an ad for a thing, and then there would be a call this 800 number now to get this thing. And part of the reason they were doing that was to figure out, first because they wanted to sell the thing, but also because they want to know. They know that in that 10-minute period, there was just this one ad that was running. And so they can measure or one ad in a particular part of the country, let's say, so they can measure what was the response to that ad. So a slightly long answer to that question. I mean, I would say that there's a very complicated story of kind of how advertising works on the internet. I could tell you in great detail actually how it works, and one of the things that's a little bit complicated is that because there are certain networks that run ads, you might be looking at two completely different websites, and knowledge about what you did on one website might somehow magically seem to be transported to another website. The reason that's happening is that both websites are using the same ad network, and there are only a small number of very large ad networks. And so they're getting information from, and whether this should be allowed is an interesting question, but you're looking at one website over here, and the ads from that website, the ad network that is serving ads on that website is storing information about you. So even when you're looking at another website over here, it's able to use the information it got from when you looked at the first website. Again, not completely obvious that should be something that is allowed to happen, but that's something that uniformly does happen. Okay, let's see. Gosh, so many interesting questions here. Well, I'm going to take a couple here. Okay. How does a space station work? Well, there's several different levels of work. So right now, there's only one space station that is actively in orbit around the Earth, the International Space Station. It's existed for, I don't know how long, 25 years maybe? Well, the first thing is it's in orbit around the Earth. So that means that the Earth's gravity is pulling it in, but it's going fast enough, about 17,000 miles an hour, that by the time it would have been pulled in by Earth's gravity, it's already moved far enough that it's sort of gone to the edge of the Earth. So if it starts at the top here, it's kind of moving fast enough in this direction that by the time it's pulled down by the Earth's gravity, it's just pulled and it's gone to the other, it's gone around to the side of the Earth. And so it just keeps going in an orbit around the Earth. Inside the space station, so space is a vacuum, means it doesn't have any air in it. There are no air molecules, or very, very few air molecules. There's probably, around where the space station is, I would guess that there are, I'm going to make a guess, I'm not completely certain, but I'm going to guess that they're on the order of maybe one air molecule in every cubic centimeter. Whereas on normally, let's think, how many are there? Well, there's maybe a billion, trillion molecules normally for us when we're breathing air. In that size of thing, but in space, there aren't any molecules of air or anything. It's almost a perfect vacuum. So in order to be able to live on the space station, you have to there has to be air there, and all it is it's an enclosed box, so to speak, an enclosed system that keeps the air inside. Now, again, it's a little complicated because the air that the air that we breathe out, we breathe in. So the atmosphere is about 78% nitrogen, 20% oxygen, and the oxygen is what we use in our lungs to. That's what our respiration is making use of. So when we breathe in, oxygen is getting into our blood, and that's what allows our whole body to work. When we breathe in oxygen, we breathe out carbon dioxide, and in this on the Earth, there's a big sort of cycle where plants effectively breathe in carbon dioxide and produce oxygen, and there's a sort of big cycle that takes place where we are exchanging, that gives us enough oxygen to breathe. On the space station, you have to have a similar kind of cycle, and you have to have you're not you're not using plants, you're using chemistry to make that cycle work. But you have to have such a cycle because you're not supplying sort of tanks of oxygen. You breathe in the oxygen, you breathe out carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is molecules in which the carbon has been attached to oxygen. Carbon atoms have been attached to oxygen atoms. Chemical processes can break those apart again, so that you again can have the oxygen to breathe in. So you have to kind of make that cycle work, and that's kind of the main thing. So the other thing you need, for example, in a space station, is you need electric power, so you don't, how do you get the electric power? You get it from big solar panels, and there'll be a big sort of array of solar panels on the International Space Station. Solar panels, same thing that you would get in solar panels on a house to get solar power. The basic idea is that when light from the sun, photons from the sun, hit these pieces actually of silicon it's sort of a silicon with extra atoms in it, in the solar cell. What's happening is photon comes in, it's got a bunch of energy, it kicks an electron out to turn it into an electron that can make an electric current. So the photon comes in, it makes an electron, it kicks the electron so that it goes off and makes an electric current, and that's essentially how the electricity is being made in a photovoltaic solar cell thing, and that's how the electricity is made on the space station. So there's some other issues. One might ask the question, if one was going to sort of send the space station off, or something like the space station off, on a 6-month voyage to Mars or something, how would it work? There are new and different issues when you do that. For example, the space station is in low Earth orbit. It is not a subject to radiation, ionizing radiation, things like X-rays, gamma rays, other things that cause trouble for human cells and things, as it would be if it was in deep space far away from the Earth. Although if there is a solar flare, for example, that can produce a bunch of high energy particles that can cause trouble even for the space station. But that's a rough it's a rough thought on that. Okay, maybe we'll do one or two others, and then I should go here. But there's a question here from Crucial Ori. Do you think math and algorithms plus graph theory are similar? How could somebody be good at one and bad at the other? Math is a very broad area, actually. You think of math as being a narrow area, but when you get to the point of people doing math for research, for example, it's actually quite broad. There are people where the thing they're really good at is visualizing geometrical objects and things. There's math where what people are really good at is understanding kind of strings of symbols and how those work. There's math where people are really good at sort of the big picture of how these different kind of abstract structures fit together. There's math where people are really good at puzzle problem solving, how do these little puzzle pieces fit together and so on. It's a quite broad area. What you see in kind of school math is somewhat narrower. It's much more focused on the more mechanical kind of, can you compute this thing, given this piece of algebra, can you work out what the answer is for this algebra problem? When it gets to things like, when it gets to you get to higher and higher level math, it's less and less about this kind of mechanical, can you work out this and that thing? And so, for example, in my own case, I think I was perhaps a little overstated, but I was certainly not great at the more mechanical kind of math. I think my lowest point was probably when I was about 10 years old, when the math I thought was just incredibly boring, and I just couldn't get interested in it at all, and just really didn't have the attention to go work out, how many of these polynomials can I expand or whatever. But it turns out that being good at sort of higher level math is quite disconnected from that. The one thing you really learn in doing those things is just how to do anything precisely enough to get the right answer. Because, somebody asks you, I don't know, was this character in this book good or bad? Well, they're probably a little bit good, a little bit bad. It's kind of it's an answer where you can kind of just sort of discuss it. But if you say, what is the answer from this math problem? The answer might be 15, or it might be 18, and it's a definite answer. There's no, well, it's roughly 15, but it might be 18 type thing. It's a definite answer. And it's really useful to learn how to do things where you kind of have enough sort of mental organization and sort of ability to be precise about things that you can actually go ahead and know, yes, I got the answer. It's 15. I got it right. It's exactly right. It's not, well, I got it roughly right, and maybe my teacher liked me, so they gave me a good grade, but I don't really know whether I got it completely right, because it's all kind of vague. So, math has this nice feature that it's definite at that level. Actually, programming and things with computers, algorithms and so on, also have that feature. It's definite at that level. One thing that's nice about the programming case is that, you're typing a piece of Wolfram language code or something. It's supposed to produce a map of the US, but actually it just produces a pink box. Okay, the computer told you, whoops, you did something wrong. So you can go back and say, what did I do wrong? Let me try and figure it out. You try and fix it. Eventually, kaboom, it makes a map of the US or whatever it is. That's kind of a nice feedback loop. It's actually, in many ways, I think it's a nicer feedback loop than what you often have to have in math, where it's kind of like, teacher says answer is wrong, but you don't necessarily, there's not the sort of satisfaction of, yes, you just managed to communicate with the computer. You managed to actually get it to do what you wanted it to do, and there it gives you the answer. It's gone and done this. So I think and now, when it comes to writing programs, the biggest problem of writing programs is making mistakes. If every program you wrote, if you could always take, well, actually, I should say a different thing. The very beginning problem of writing a program is, what do you want the program to do? You have to be able to conceptualize what it is you want from this program and how you can break down what you want into something you can explain to the computer. It's a little bit like in math, there are kind of these word problems where you're given, some sort of description in words, and you have to turn that into math. But the computer case is actually, I think, a much better case of that, because it's something where you kind of might know, oh, I want to have the thing work. I want it to do this. You have something in your mind you want it to do. Maybe it's something you wanted it to do. It's not an exercise. It's not something from school. It's just something you wanted it to do. You have it in your mind. And maybe you realize at some point, gosh, that actually isn't quite the right thing that I wanted. Let me change a little bit what I wanted it to have the computer do. And then you go off and figure out how to tell the computer that as well. But so first thing is, how can you take from what you think you want the computer to do, break it down in a form where the computer could have the potential to understand? Then you have sort of the mechanical process of explaining it to the computer. I've spent a large part of my life trying to make it as easy as possible for people to explain things to computers, to have a a language, a computational language that us humans can kind of wrap our brains around as well as possible, but the computers can also understand, and where the computer is doing as much of the work as possible, and where you just have to be able to sort of crispen up your thinking to the point where you can express it in our computational language and then feed it to the computer. Okay, so that's sort of the beginning of how you get a computer to do things. Well, then the problem is, particularly when you write larger programs, the problem is you make mistakes. Why do you make mistakes? Because it's super difficult to figure out all possible implications of a program you write. Turns out one of the things I've discovered scientifically many years ago, and it's really an important thing that sort of fed into this work on fundamental theory of physics now, is even really, really tiny programs can do really complicated things. So even though you say, this is a tiny program, I got to be able to understand what it does. Well, no, sorry. There's a sort of theoretical scientific reason why, even though the program may be very small, it may do really complicated things which you can't foresee. And so it isn't, you shouldn't be embarrassed that you make mistakes in programs, because programs will, the sort of a program, even though it may be quite a small program, has the potential to do things that are so complicated, there's no way you could possibly foresee those things. And so that's kind of the theory of bugs in programs. You know, you write a program, you say, I think I've thought of all the things this program could do, but no, you really won't have been able to in many cases. And you know, in the early days when people were first inventing the idea of programming, nobody had this idea of bugs. Nobody thought that would happen. Nobody had conceptualized this point that it was sort of inevitable that programs would have sort of things that you wouldn't be able to foresee. But they do. And so then when you write programs, one of the goals of people like me, language designers, is to make it as easy as possible, to make it so that it is, so that the correct programs that will do what you want, are the most natural programs to write. That we're kind of leading you to write a program that is likely to do what you want, as opposed to making it really difficult. You have to really kind of stand in your head to get the program to do what you want. But it's really easy to make a program that will do something you probably don't want. One of the goals of language design is to make it so that you're typically going to do this. I mean, it's like if you're making a mechanical device and you want it to be easy to press the stop button. Make the stop button a big red button. Don't make the stop button this little weird thing that you have to open up a thing and do this and that, and then you hit the stop button. The goal is make the things you might want to do, and you might want to do, make them as easy as possible. And that's a goal of language design. That's kind of the responsibility of people like me, to make it as easy as possible for people to write correct programs. But nevertheless, as soon as the things you want the program to do can get it all complicated, it is inevitable that there'll be places where you can't foresee what it will do, and there may be a bug in your program. So this process of debugging a program is an interesting intellectual exercise. It's an interesting intellectual process. It's very much easier in our Wolfram language, computational language, than it has typically been, because our language is a higher level language. The individual things you're doing in it are much bigger, and sort of within each piece, it's going to do the right thing. The question is, did you assemble the pieces correctly? It also has a feature that, in technical terms, it's a symbolic language, which means that any piece of the program you can sort of take out and use on its own. In most sort of low-level programming languages, it's not a trivial thing to take a little tiny piece of a program out and see what it does. In our language, it happens to be very easy, and that's kind of the first step in debugging a program is, okay, you see it did something wrong, first of all, you sort of instrument it and say, what are you doing inside program? And have it print out and say, I'm doing this, I'm doing this, I'm doing this. You say, oh, well, that piece you got wrong. So you go and you take that piece of the program out and you look at it on its own and you say, did that do the right thing or not? Then if it didn't, and it's this little tiny program, you have a better chance to go and look inside and see, oh, why did it do the wrong thing? And eventually say, aha, I realized why it did the wrong thing. Now, there is huge variation in people's ability to do debugging of programs. It's a strange skill. I don't know what it's correlated with, but some people are really quite good at it and some people are not. I think the typical thing is, well, first of all, it's a think without assumptions. Because as soon as you think you know what's going on, the chances are you'll not notice the thing that's actually going on. So that's one kind of thing. It's also a kind of a logical sort of deduction type thing. I mean, it's very program debugging is something that well, it's sort of, there's related things. There's debugging of programs. There's debugging of computer systems. You know, why did my computer's audio not work or something? And there's sort of a completely different area, which is medical diagnosis. You know, why do I have some symptom that exists in, you know, some medical symptom that exists? These are three kinds of thinking that are all actually, I think, rather related. And they're interesting. They're very interesting sort of, and they're very different. It's different from a lot of what one normally does. And it's really interesting to try and learn to be good at these things. And for example, debugging programs, as I say, don't make any assumptions about what's going on. Just look at what it's doing, try and figure out, you know, why did it do what it did? Don't say from the beginning, well, if you get very experienced, you will start getting intuition of what kind of a problem it is. You won't know what the problem is, but you'll know what kind of a problem it is. It's the same thing, you know, experienced doctors get an intuition about what kind of a problem something is likely to be. I think that the so you know, but this process. So you're asking. I think the original question was, why would people be sort of good at math, bad at algorithms, good at algorithms, bad at math? They're both pretty diverse areas. So there's a lot of different things in math. There's a lot of different things to do with programming and algorithms and so on. And I think it's, you know, where there's overlap is not clear. And I think that one of the things that happens is, well, in math, there's different kinds of math you can do. You know, there's, for example, in my own case, I'm not great at visualizing 3D shapes. Like if you asked me, you know, what would be the, I don't know, some you know, imagine an icosahedron and imagine this and how does the edge of this go to that, go to this, go to that? I'm not very good at that. One of my kids, my older daughter, is really good at that. I remember from when she was very young, just some question came up and she's just sitting in the back of the car or something, and some question about polyhedra comes up, and she's like, oh yeah, there's a line that goes from here to there, and it's like, how do you figure that out? Well, you can visualize it. I can't visualize it. She can. She's now a math graduate student, so that kind of, you know, that was that line. But I think that the you know, different people are good at different things. I mean, there's plenty of math that somebody like me can do, even though I'm really pretty useless at sort of the 3D visualization. You know, how does this shape look, just in one's mind's eye, so to speak. And so I think it's you know, it's very it's more a question of, what do you want to do in these areas? Do you like what comes out from doing math? Do you like understanding these abstract structures? Do you like the puzzle problem solving of math? You know, if you like these things, then there's a good chance that there's a sort of a part of that that you'll discover that you're good at. All right, I think we should wrap up here, and I thank you all for joining us. There were a bunch of other interesting questions which I was sorry I didn't get to. And I hope we'll have a chance to do this again. Probably next week we will pick a different focused topic, and look forward to seeing you all then. Okay, thanks. Bye.